guys, you're welcome back. My name is Bukumi. Thanks so much for clicking.
That's how we interact with each other in language. But when you have a text like the Quran that is always read through the Sunnah of the Prophet, you have to look at what the Sunnah of the Prophet is telling you to understand the intended meaning of the text. And in that case, the intended meaning of God's words is not necessarily the one that's closest to the evident meaning. It is the one that is best supported by the evidence of the other verses of the Quran, of the Sunnah of the Prophet, of our understanding of the overall teachings of Islam. This is what tells us the intended meaning of the Quran. And so when we read that verse that I mentioned, the verse 434, the quote-unquote wife-beating verse, when you read that, you don't read it through what comes to your mind first. You read it what comes to your mind after you understand the Sunnah of the Prophet. And the Sunnah of the Prophet on this issue is very clear. What does Aisha say in Sahih Hadith? She says, the Prophet, مَا ضَرَبَ أَحَدًا قَطْ. The Prophet never struck anybody biyadihi. Never struck anybody with his hand, except, not a man, not a woman, not a servant, except in the path of jihad. Never struck anybody. And when this verse is revealed that I read to you about adribuhunna, the context in which it's revealed, according to Hadith and Sunan Tirmidhi and other books, is that a woman comes to the Prophet and complains about her husband striking her. And the Prophet says, La tadribu ima Allah. Do not strike the female servants of God. And then Omar comes to the Prophet, depending on the version of the hadith, comes to the Prophet and says, the women in Medina are not, they're very, they're kind of overcoming their husbands. They're very forceful in their personalities. They're not like the women in Mecca. And so then then this verse is revealed and talks about how that if your wife is having nushuz, first you admonish her. She does not desist. Then you cease sleeping with her. She still continues. Then the verse says you strike her. But what does the Prophet say about that? He said, "Ulaika laysa ulaika khiyarakum." Those people who strike their wives are not the best of you. And another version of the hadith in the Mustadrak of Al-Hakim and Naysaburi, he says, "Khiyarakum lan tadribu." The best of you will not strike your wives. And in Sahih Bukhari, the Prophet says, alayhi salatu wasalam, لا يجلد أحدكم امرأته جلد العبد ثم يجامعها آخر النهار أو آخر اليوم. Let none of you strike his wife like he'd strike a slave and then go and sleep with her at the end of the day. And in his final sermon, his final khutbah at Hajj, what is one of the things the Prophet says? He says, "Attaqullah fi nisaikum." Fear God as concerns your wives, because you have taken them as a trust from God. They're in your trust. And he says, only if they do commit what he says is a fahisha mubayyina, an egregious, inappropriate behavior, egregious fahisha. Then strike them, but what? Only strike them darbat ghayr mubarrih, in a way that leaves no mark, that causes no harm. So that's the Sunnah of the Prophet that we have to, that through which we read this verse, and through which every Islamic school of thought would read this verse. Which is why in the various schools of law, and I see a lot of you are students here, you know how complicated fiqh is. You know how many different opinions, like for example in the Hanafi madhab you can have, Zahir Riwaya, and you have the opinion of Imam Abi Hanifa, you have the opinion of Abu Yusuf, you have the opinion of Muhammad bin Hassan Shibani, you have the opinion of Zufar bin Hudayl, you have all these opinions. So fiqh is very complicated. But across the different madhabs, there's the same theme over and over again. You can only strike your wife lightly in a way that causes no harm. If you cause her harm, you're liable for the diya. You're liable for compensating her for injuries. And according to every school except the Hanafi school, a judge, if a wife goes to a judge and says, my husband's beating me, and there's witnesses or evidence that the husband's beating her, or the husband confesses, the judge can do what's called tafriq. He can end the marriage legally. And the wife will get to keep her mahar, and the husband has to pay her nafaqah until her iddah ends, and the marriage is over. And this is what I found very interesting in my research, that if you look at Sharia court information about Sharia courts, whether it's in, Iran in the 900s, or Andalusia in the 900s, or Syria in the 1300s, or, Janneh in Mali in the 1900s, or Zanzibar in the 1900s, or Yemen in the mid-20th century, or Egypt in the 1920s, you always see the same thing. Husband or wife goes to the court, says, my husband's beating me. If there's evidence that he's beating her, like physically, if there's witnesses, if the husband confesses, judge would end the marriage. If the woman wants, he'll end the marriage. She keeps her dowry. She gets maintenance. And the husband, if there's injury, has to pay to compensate the injury. And this is, for example, in the Hanafi realm of Palestine in the 17th century. There's one case where a woman has some of her teeth knocked out by her husband, and the judge says, you have to pay your wife 3 gold coins because this is the diya for teeth. And so it's very interesting because in the tradition of American law and British law, it's only in the very late 19th century or in the 20th century that a husband can ever have to pay any money to his wife. Before then, married women aren't allowed to own property. And there's something called in law tort immunity, where the husband's actually immune from any case that his wife brings against him that he harmed her. It's impossible for him to be liable financially to her. But in the Islamic tradition, since the very beginning, since the life of the Prophet ﷺ, part of the Sharia was that just because you're married to somebody doesn't mean that if you injure them, you don't have to pay for it. You can't be held accountable before the law. You're always held accountable. In the Sharia, if you harm anybody, you're held accountable. Doesn't matter if they're your wife or your husband.
Alright guys, so I really enjoyed this video, and I don't know what I can say, but I'm just surprised that they explained it in the way they explained it. I was not expecting anything less per se, guys, because these 2 Muslim scholars just explained the misconception, or the misinterpretation of a particular verse of the Quran. That's Quran 4 verse 34, whereas it was said in the Quran that you should beat your wife, domestic violence, and now they've come to explain it to us that it is not so. But we Christians also explain it in that manner, that what they read in the Bible regarding so many things they do not agree, that they feel is more of pornography, is against the law is against God's commandments that people did in the Bible. We also say it is not written in that manner. You get what I'm saying? I don't want to go into references. All I want to say is that, well, people interpret or understand something based on how they see it, based on how the Quran said it, is how some people will understand it. Even though the Muslim scholars are saying that we should try and look at it in another dimension, we should look at it deeper, you see that that's not what it's saying. Even if make us that maybe Quran is just trying to tell you that if your wife is not listening to you, just tap her. How will you tap? You that you are already angry, can you tap your wife? Is it possible? If you are that kind of person that is always so angry, can you just tap your wife and say, okay, I'm tapping her, she has done something wrong? I don't think it's ever possible. So That's what I have to say, guys. I don't know if I'm making sense at all, but all I'm trying to say is that people understand things based on how they see. So you will not blame people for no accepting or saying that the Quran promotes so many bad things that is not supposed to promote, because that's how some people got to read it or see it from the Quran. But that is how this is just my opinion. I'm not here to bash anybody or any religion, but I'm just trying to give my opinion based on their explanation. And I don't know, I might not really make sense, guys, but I'm so glad you guys watched this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay blessed. Bye.